actually have my first MIDI keyboard, which when I was starting out, the first couple of Watched Out records, you know, I just had this and an old like Windows desktop computer, and and that was it, and like a really crappy microphone. So I'm sure David would have a fit singing this thing. As you could tell, there's not a ton of gear. When I started out, I did a lot of sampling, and then Within and Without, my most recent record before Paracosm, I was using a lot of synthesizers. Working on this new record, started with acoustic guitar and quickly led to quite a lot of more kind of orchestral sounds, and most of that is happening on the computer. There's plugins which, you know, someone has gone through and recorded individual notes off of whatever the instrument is and made them playable via, you know, MIDI keyboards. So I believe this should be just a harp sound. So. You know, it's not as good as the real thing, but, you know, having not studied the harp, it's great to be able to play. So this is actually the part from the record. It's been chopped up and you know, placed on these pads for the live performance. This rig will be my wife's kind of live setup, and she can kind of be triggering things from different places. There's some drum samples that have been cut up and placed here, and this is like an Indian percussion music called the tabla. I mean, it's not a brand new technology. This kind of MIDI stuff has been around since the 80s, but I think computer technology is finally at a place where it can handle, you know, a huge setup like this. And I think that's a really inspiring thing. Like, you know, for someone starting out, you know, you can just have a simple MIDI keyboard and a computer and kind of, again, an orchestra at your fingertips. After visiting Calgary, we were able to visit Tree Sound Studios in Atlanta. Tree Sound has been around since the 90s, and there's multiple rooms there. It just feels like the really old school, big money kind of recording studios.
So, Studio A.
Oh, wow.
This is a George Augsburger designed room. We do a lot of analog recording here. We use a lot of old vintage gear. We record live musicians.
Paul has been working in the music business since the 70s or the 80s, and seeing how the business has changed over the years, moving from an all analog tape recording style, and then, you know, in the last 10 years, how Pro Tools and digital recording has kind of taken over the industry.
It started back in the 80s when MIDI came out. The sound of music changed, to me for the worse, because it was the overuse or abuse of that technology.
Yep.
And then grunge rock came back. And I was like, thank the Lord, humans playing, you know? So it was like, that same thing, I believe, has happened again with Logic, Pro Tools. I think it's kind of come full circle, and you're kind of a good example
Yep.
of real sounds coming back around, even though you work in the box.
Totally. It was really interesting hearing his take on the style of working in the box. While he was open to the idea of, you know, working with computers, I think he definitely preferred the old way of thinking. But I think he overall had a really open kind of mindedness about that style of recording. So I'm just gonna roll on these. We good? Paul allowed me to actually sit down and sample this old Mellotron, and the great thing about it is that it wasn't in pristine shape like some of the instruments that we saw at Oddities. It was in need of quite a bit of servicing, but it had a really crazy kind of demented tone to it. It really proves that, you know, each of these instruments is kind of unique in their own way.
All these old instruments kind of have their own sound. They're all a little bit different, you know? I don't know how familiar you are with the B3, but to start this thing, you gotta like get this wheel spinning inside. So you hold this button on,
That's awesome.
and you hear it spin up. And once it spins up, then you flip the run switch on and let it off.
When I started out making the record, I think I was most interested in using interesting sounds more than anything else, which kind of led me on that path of, discovering some of these old instruments. And if it wasn't for people like David, who are finding these things and restoring them and keeping them alive in some ways, I never would have stumbled upon it. And I think he's probably really excited about young musicians like myself kind of taking these sounds and reappropriating them and using them in new and interesting ways. There's an old style of making records, and there's the newer digital side of things, which is more the background I've come out of. And I think the big thing that I've come away with is there's no right or wrong way to do it, to make music.